Casio made a watch that controlled the television, another one that measured temperature from a distance, and another that tried to turn the wrist into a voice recorder. This is not a joke. It actually happened. And during the 80s and 90s, Casio turned the watch into one of the strangest laboratories in all of consumer electronics. They weren't thinking like traditional watchmakers. They were thinking like an electronics company, obsessed with miniaturizing functions, cramming them into a tiny case and launching them into the world to see what would happen. And from that mindset came some of the strangest, most ambitious, and most fascinating watches the brand has ever made. In this video, we're going to look at 6 models that perfectly capture that experimental era. CMD40, CA53W, DBCV500, FTP10, AT552 Janus, and TSR100. Some were useful. Others were absurd. But they all share one thing. They look like objects designed by a company that refused to accept that a watch should only tell time. Let's start with one of the most eye-catching of them all. CMD40. The CMD40 was launched as a wrist remote controller. And yes, that means exactly what it sounds like. A watch that worked as a remote control. You could point your wrist at the TV, the stereo, the VCR, or other infrared-compatible devices and change channels, raise the volume, or execute basic functions right from the watch. Seen today, it seems like an idea somewhere between brilliant and ridiculous. But in context, it made quite a lot of sense. In the early 90s, the average living room could be cluttered with remote controls. TV, VHS, stereo, receiver, cable box. The idea of unifying everything into a single device was genuinely appealing. The problem wasn't the vision. The problem was the format, because doing it from a watch meant compromises on every front. Function navigation was limited. Programming codes could be slow. The infrared emitter needed the right angle and close enough range. And let's be honest, most of the time, it was faster to just grab the real remote sitting on the table. But that's exactly what makes the CMD40 so interesting. Casio correctly identified a real need. People wanted to centralize their interfaces. They just chose a platform that was too small and too far ahead of its time. In a way, the CMD40 predicted a logic that would later become completely normal. One single device to control your electronic life. Today, that's the phone. In 1993, Casio thought it could be your watch. And even if the execution was awkward, the idea is still incredible. If the CMD40 tried to control the environment, the CA53W tried to bring a classic tool to the wrist, the calculator. The CA53W is probably one of the most famous and instantly recognizable Casio watches ever made. Its face full of tiny buttons turned it into a visual icon. Even people who never used one know exactly what it is the moment they see it. Technically, the proposition was simple. An 8-digit calculator built into a compact digital watch. In practice, using it required patience. The buttons were tiny. You had to press them carefully. Running long calculations wasn't exactly comfortable. And yet, none of that ever really mattered. Because the CA53W survived, not by being the best possible calculator, but because of something far more powerful: its identity. It represented an era when carrying a calculator still felt futuristic. And it had an unmistakable aesthetic. Geometric, technical, nerdy, functional. It's one of those objects where real utility and cultural value go their separate ways. Maybe it wasn't the most practical way to do math, but it was a fantastic way to look like someone who had technology on their wrist. And the most impressive part is that it never fully disappeared. Unlike so many of Casio's weird experiments, the CA53W stayed alive. It didn't end up as a forgotten curiosity. It became a classic. And that's also part of what makes talking about watches like these so enjoyable. Because not everything interesting in horology comes from perfection. Sometimes the most memorable things come from a strange idea, an uncomfortable solution, or an object that tried something no one else dared to try. If you enjoy this side of watchmaking, the strangest, the smartest, the most experimental, subscribe, and in the comments, tell me which of these models you find most fascinating so far. Now let's move on to one of the strangest and most ambitious, DBCV 500. This model took Casio's obsession with miniaturization into truly unusual territory, recording and playing back audio from a watch. Yes, audio. The DBCV 500 wasn't just a databank or a digital organizer. It could also record short voice messages. The idea was clear. If something came to mind, you didn't need to write it down. You could just talk to the watch. In theory, that sounded revolutionary. A voice note system on your wrist in the late 90s was a genuinely powerful idea. Today we're used to talking to our phones or sending voice messages all the time. But back then, fitting that function into a watch was almost consumer science fiction. The problem, again, showed up when you actually used it. You had to bring the watch up to your mouth, speak clearly, accept limited audio quality, and also deal with the fact that in public, you'd look like someone talking to their wrist. That turned every real use into a kind of small performance. But even so, the DBCV 500 has something admirable about it. It wasn't just a watch with an extra feature. It was a serious attempt to turn the watch into a personal organization hub. Time, calendar, database, calculator, recorder. Casio was testing a question that today feels completely normal. Can a portable device capture information the instant we think of it? The answer, at that moment, was yes, but with many limitations. Still, the concept was so strong that it's impossible not to look at it with respect. The DBCV 500 wasn't just strange, it was visionary. Next we have one of the most intelligently designed of the entire group, FTP-10. Unlike other experimental Casio models, the FTP-10 didn't rely so much on packing in more electronics. Its genius was in the architecture. At first glance, it looked like a relatively understated analog watch. But it hid a trick. The front face opened with a flip cover, and underneath appeared a digital interface with a calculator. It was a watch with a double identity. On the outside, discreet. On the inside, technological. And that solution solved several things at once. First, it protected the inner display. Second, it created a completely different usage gesture. And third, it turned the watch into something almost secret, as if it were hiding a second personality. That's what makes the FTP-10 so interesting. It wasn't just trying to stack up visible functions. It played with revelation. To access certain features, it wasn't enough to glance at your wrist. You had to open it, discover it, interact with it, close it again. That small ritual completely transformed the experience. It gave it theatricality. It gave it character. It gave it the feeling of a sophisticated gadget that very few watches ever achieve. And there was real logic behind it too. The cover protected the most delicate part. The exterior aesthetic could stay clean. And the user got two watches in one, a serious one on the outside and an experimental one on the inside. The FTP-10 demonstrates something important. Innovation doesn't always mean adding more technology. Sometimes it means reorganizing it better. And now we arrive, probably, at the most forward-thinking of all. AT552 Janus. This watch is special because it doesn't look radical at first glance. It doesn't have an exaggeratedly futuristic appearance. It doesn't show off tiny keyboards like the C, a 53W. It doesn't look like a scandalous experiment, but that's exactly where the trap is. Because the AT552 Janus hid a surprising idea for its time, a touch-sensitive crystal that responded to gestures. Instead of using tiny rubber buttons for the calculator, the user would trace numbers and symbols directly onto the watch glass. In other words, they interacted with the surface itself. Said today, that might sound normal. But we're talking about an idea that anticipated an interaction logic that would dominate the entire world decades later. That makes the AT552 Janus deeply fascinating. It wasn't just miniaturizing an existing function. It was proposing an entirely new relationship between person and device. And it did so with an uncommon elegance, because visually the watch was far cleaner than other experimental Casios. It didn't shout its functions. It hid them. It didn't look like a calculator. It looked like a refined watch with a technological secret. That duality perfectly explains the name Janus, the two-faced god. An object with two natures: classic appearance, futuristic behavior. Of course, in practice it wasn't perfect. Stroke recognition could fail. Finger pressure, gesture speed, or contact angle could all affect the result. But even with those limitations, the experience must have felt almost magical. Drawing on a crystal to control a portable machine in 1984 wasn't just novel. It was a vision of the future. And that's why the AT552 Janus isn't just one of Casio's strangest watches. It's also one of the most conceptually ambitious. And if all of that wasn't already enough, Casio went even further with the TSR 100. This watch incorporated something that sounds almost impossible within that format: infrared temperature measurement. It wasn't limited to showing ambient temperature. The TSR 100 was designed so you could point it at a surface and get a thermal reading. In other words, it turned the watch into a kind of portable, remote thermometer. That puts it in a category of its own, because we're no longer just talking about calculators, organizers, or remote controls. We're talking about sensors. The TSR 100 represented the phase in which Casio seemed determined to test any technology that could physically fit inside a watch case. And, as in other cases, execution had its limits. Accuracy depended on distance, angle, and surface type. Reflective objects could throw off the reading. And the experience required a certain care to avoid making the whole process feel clumsy. But even so, the impression it must have made was enormous. Pointing your wrist at a cup, an object, or a surface, and getting a thermal measurement must have felt like a scene straight out of domestic science fiction. The TSR 100 is possibly one of the best examples of Casio's experimental philosophy in its purest form. Not because it was the most necessary watch, but because it shows just how far the brand was willing to explore territory that no conventional watch would have ever attempted to touch. When you look at the CMD40, the CA53W, the DBCV500, the FTP10, the AT552 Janus, and the TSR 100 altogether, it becomes clear that we're not looking at simple, isolated oddities. We're seeing one and the same mindset. Casio would observe a function, a need, or an emerging technology and ask, can we put this on the wrist? Sometimes the answer ended in a practical product. Sometimes in an uncomfortable object. Sometimes in a strange marvel that felt like it arrived too soon. But the important thing is that they tried. The CMD40 imagines centralized control before the smartphone existed as an everyday command center. The CA53W turned the calculator into a cultural icon. The DBCV500 explored instant voice capture in a portable format. The FTP10 reimagined the architecture of the watch itself. The AT552 Janus anticipated touch and gesture-based interaction. And the TSR 100 brought infrared sensors to the wrist when that still sounded disproportionate. Not all of them were massive successes. Not all of them were truly practical. But all of them are evidence of an era when a major company was still willing to launch bold, strange, and sometimes even absurd ideas into the real market. And maybe that's exactly why they feel so appealing today. Because they don't look like products born from a committee that tried to minimize risk. They look like products born from engineers, designers, and executives who accepted the possibility of failure in order to try something new. It's easy to look at these watches and laugh a little at their quirks, but it's also impossible not to admire the level of imagination they represent. These weren't just watches. They were portable experiments, small technological manifestos, proof that during one very specific moment in time, someone genuinely believed the future could live on the wrist. And in many ways, even if those ideas were imperfect, they weren't entirely wrong. If you enjoyed this format, I can make a second part with other experimental Casios that are just as strange. And I also want to know which of these you find most interesting. CMD40, CA53W, DB-CV500, FTP10, AT552, Janus, or TSR100. Leave it in the comments, and if you ever own one of these, or know of another strange watch from Casio or any other brand, share that too. See you in the next video.